Conversation with Ron MacLean.
Welcome to In Conversation. Today on the show, Tanya Talaga and Peter Mansbridge. Tanya Talaga is an award-winning author. This is her book, Seven Fallen Feathers. And on the back, you can see a number of prizes, the RBC Taylor Prize. She also won the Shaughnessy, which is an award for political writing, shortlisted on so many awards and winner of so many others. Tanya's also written All Our Relations. She's a great author. She's a journalist. As a reporter, she has a piece coming out in the Globe and Mail tomorrow, and I'm assuming with the RCMP video being released late last night, a CBC exclusive had the footage of the RCMP's handling of Chief Ellen Adam of the Chipewyan First Nations. So we'll address that, obviously. She's been a 5-time Michener Award nominee, which is for public service writing, 2-time National Newspaper Award. In 2018, Tanya did the CBC Massey Lectures, which is a tremendous honor. So she's obviously been writing and reflecting on equity, social justice, professional norms, and our First Nations for a long, long time. And Peter Mansbridge joins Tanya on the broadcast today. Peter comes back to the show for a second time, and you know he's a longtime colleague of mine, obviously with 3 decades at the helm of CBC's The National, and that's what he's best known for. So many television awards for his work there, so many honorary degrees. But more recently, I've been relying on Peter for something he's created, a podcast called The Bridge, which he began really as a daily. It was a missive to coincide with coverage of COVID-19 and to help us understand some of the health and ethical and personal stories around coronavirus. But before long, he also delved into the economic crisis and now, of course, the social crisis. And that podcast, The Bridge, hit 500,000 downloads this week. So I don't know how that semi-retirement's going, Peter, but honored to have the two of them, each a wordsmith, and got me thinking a little bit about words, because that's a huge part of us trying to have conversations right now, is the words we choose. And I remember there was a writer named Bruna Martinuzzi from Vancouver, wrote a book called The Leader as a Mensch. A mensch is the Yiddish word for integrity or honor. And in the book, she starts with how her professor had said there was a survey which asked, what is the most beautiful word in the English language? And the winner was windowsill. And I thought, wow, what a great word. Not only because it sounds nice, but because windowsill, it's where we get our view.
Some authors write important books. Some write gripping stories. Tanya Talaga has accomplished both in her new book, Seven Fallen Feathers: Racism, Death, and Hard Truths in a Northern City.
Talaga's reporting and research is formidable and rigorous. She presents a very powerful marshalling of the facts and a document of Indigenous suffering.
This book makes us pay attention in a way that we all need to pay attention.
This is the CBC Television Network.
Peter Mansbridge, CBC News, McDonough.
The National with Peter Mansbridge.
Good evening. And hello there, Peter Mansbridge here once again with the latest episode of The Bridge Daily. Let's get started.
And here are Tanya and Peter, and it's nice to introduce you two to one another, and really lovely to see you both again. So Tanya, I'll just open the floor to you to kind of explain what you're feeling today and what we should be thinking about today.
Buzu anin Tanya Talaga Nagisnakas. I'm grateful, Ron, to have this opportunity to be on your show, and I'm grateful to meet Peter as well. It's been a hard few weeks. It's been a hard few months. You know, when COVID started, I kept hearing about what was happening in hospitals and in cities, about people needing help and support for things that are closing down. People were losing jobs. Everyone was going through so much. And I kept on wondering how we're doing with our communities. I kept on wondering what is going to happen if this pandemic hits communities across Canada, First Nations communities, where we don't have proper infrastructures, where we don't have doctors, where we don't have any nurses. How are we going to respond in a public health crisis when we don't have running water in so many of our communities? I've been thinking about that quite a bit, you know. And then when you add on to that, what we've been seeing lately with the demonstrations across Turtle Island about George Floyd's death, about where we are now as a society and where we are when it comes to racism, racism is something that we see every day as Indigenous people. Racism is something we've lived in this country and continue to live in this country for such a long time. I think of very much how racism, systemic racism, is in all of our institutions. It's in our governments, it's in our schools, it's in our corporations, it's in our communities, because it grew there. It grew there from a lack of understanding of who Indigenous people are. It grew there because we didn't learn the true history of this country, what happened to us with Indian residential schools, what happened with the child welfare system, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. None of that was taught in the curriculum in the schools for when you were growing up, Ron, or from when Peter was growing up. Everyone's catching up now and trying to understand and try and figure out, how did we get here as a country? But we as Indigenous people know how we got here as a country, with Canada's quiet racism and indifference of looking away. And these are the things I've been thinking about quite a bit lately, and seeing what's been going on in the States and what's been going on here for us for such a long period of time. You know, on social media today, there are images of Chief Allen Adam, the Athabasca Chippewan chief, and he was tackled by RCMP officers over a supposed driving infraction, an expired license. And it was caught on video. But how many instances have we seen caught on video of this happening? Of the police beating up members of our community? We see it so often. And this one has galvanized people too. And it's because of the time we're in now. And when I think of what's happening across Turtle Island, I think that maybe the time has come for everyone to stand up, not just Indigenous people, not just Black Americans and Black Canadians, but everybody, the will of the majority. We have to stand together and say, it's not okay anymore. That's what I think of.
Please, Peter.
Listen, I bow to Tanya on what she's just said, everything that she's just said, because she's captured the moment. I mean, we're living through a moment because of two overwhelming things, the pandemic and everything that's come as a result of the George Floyd murder. And that's what it was. It was a murder. It's how we deal with this moment. It appears that, especially on this second issue that has come before us in the last 3 weeks, that in fact, an overwhelming number of people want change, both in the United States and in Canada. They want change. So how are they going to get it? And are they going to get it? There are some indications that it's happening in some areas. But overwhelming change will take exactly what Tanya said. It's going to take leadership in all areas, not just, in our case, in Ottawa. Mm-hmm. It's going to take leadership in the justice system. It's going to take leadership in corporation boardrooms like the ones you see behind me here. Leadership is going to be key to how we move forward with change. What's generating it? You know, Tanya hit it again. It's the videos. What was it Will Smith said the other day? Racism is not getting worse, it's getting filmed. Mm-hmm. And that's right. You know, imagine if these last 3 weeks had happened without somebody holding a cell phone, mm-hmm. when those cops brutalized George Floyd in Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. If nobody had recorded that, would anything have happened? Would anybody have said anything? Would there have been any meaningful protests, not only in Minneapolis, but across North America and across the world? Mm-hmm. Probably not. And now we're seeing the same thing with the video that Tanya referred to from yesterday. You know, I have learned, as I think all of us in journalism have learned over these last 10 or 15 years when videos started appearing, that you got to be careful to rush to immediate judgment, right? You've got to see all the facts. You've got to see the big picture of what was happening in those moments. You've got to hear from people who were there. You've got to see other camera angles, all of that. these two examples, I'm not sure how much more you need to see or hear. It's kind of pretty clear what happened. But, to bring it back, we're in a moment. And in this country, we're in a moment where we're confronting or hopefully we're confronting our history of racism and what we're going to do about it. And what we're going to do about it will take everybody, all of us, starting by looking at ourselves and calling ourselves out about how we carry on our own lives. What are our own feelings? How racist are we in our actions? And if we are, what we're going to do about dealing with that. But we got to be honest with ourselves. And that sometimes can be brutally difficult.
Tanya, you're well equipped to follow that with some of the things we can do, but I am keen on Peter's idea. Two things, really. Leadership is one, because the archetypal leader was kind of brash, almost arrogant, powerful, and keeping that power. But humility seems to be the greatest leader's history. And then the other one is, the wisdom of an elder. It feels like there's a generational push, the youth movement, that's a huge part of the leadership right now. It's not, what you read from Plato or whomever. So go on about that, if you will, or you can take it right into things that we should be doing to make the change.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think, we're all getting a big push from the youth right now. We're getting a push from everyone that's standing together. And, what Peter said is very true. And I often think back to, especially over watching what's been happening in the last several weeks. I've been thinking a lot about Martin Luther King's speech at Stanford University in 1967. And in that speech, he described the other America, how there were two different Americas. And this is a speech that he gave 3 years after civil rights legislation passed in the US in 1964. And still nothing was changing, And I think back to how he described the haves and the have-nots in society. And I often describe there being two Canadas, one for non-Indigenous people and one for Indigenous people, because, as we all know, and I will hopefully not turn this into a history lesson, but the Indian Act is a racist piece of legislation that we still have on our books today. And it is really quite remarkable that this act governs the lives of every single First Nation person in this country. And it governs everything from the type of glasses you can wear to the type of coffin that will be purchased for you when you die. We live in a country that way. So when I think of Martin Luther King and I think of the other America, I see the same thing happening here in Canada. And I see, things like legislation being passed. And this is also part of his point with his speech. You can pass all the legislation you want in the world. We can pass federal UNDRIP legislation to align ourselves with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and that we will elevate rights in this country to be there, to be on par with that, which over 150 countries have signed. You can pass all the legislation you want in the world, but it doesn't matter at all if the will of the majority is not behind it. You can have well-meaning politicians. Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller has come out and said strong, supportive messages. He may get it, but all the people that work for him perhaps don't. There are so many spots where we need to change. We need to bring education in, and everyone needs to know the true history of this country in order for us to get out of it. And what Martin Luther King was saying was about the will of the majority. The people need to push this forward, because if you wait on time, nothing will happen. Progress of a society will not happen if we wait on time. We have to make that progress. And the youth are leading us that way. The demonstrations are leading us that way. The calls to do things, to defund the police, which leads me into what you were also saying, where can we go? Those aren't scary words, defunding the police. What that means actually is moving funding from parts of what the police do into other parts. You can think of, for example, Lester Donaldson, the shooting of Lester Donaldson. How many decades ago was that? Peter, you might remember that. He was a Black man in Toronto that was shot by police, and he was in mental distress. We have a history of this happening in this country. Think of Sammy Atim on the TTC streetcar being shot 8 times by police. Why are police responding to mental health calls? Can we not have teams of mental health nurses or social services providers providing that for us? Move the funding. Have a different response. It isn't as scary as it sounds.
Tanya, I live in Halton region, Oakville, Ontario, and the Mayor Rob Burton put out a story about the approach they use in Halton. They don't spend that much on policing, believe it or not. They're about half of what they spend on paramedics and firefighters. They use what they call the Pelian principles of community policing, and it's an approach based on community development and prevention rather than reaction to social problems. So there's one example that I've read. It's Peter, over to you. There's so much every time Tanya speaks that I know must be rattling around in you. So you just take it.
I'm not sure which off ramp to take from what's
right. I know it's really good.
There's so many. Let me just make a couple of points. She mentioned Mark Miller and his role in the federal cabinet, and the fact that he's saying a lot of the things that sound right at this point. You know, I've watched a lot of people in that portfolio over the last 50 years. I tend to believe him. He spent a lot of his life preparing for this role. But your point about the bureaucracy he leads and the various departments across the country that have an impact on this is so true. You know, I won't bore you with the history, but after 50 years of doing interviews with people, whether they're ministers or bureaucrats, I find myself still asking the same questions and often getting the same answers that I've had over half a century. That progress moving forward clearly hasn't happened, or we wouldn't be in this situation right now. Hopefully this is a turning point. Part of that turning point is, as both of you have mentioned, is young people. And that's where I see an interesting point in these last 3 months, the kind of joining of the two great crises, the pandemic and the results of the George Floyd death. And that the pandemic, in a way, has given young people the opportunity to take part in a movement that's unlike anything we've seen, certainly unlike anything I've ever seen. And I was there in the 60s. I saw a lot of stuff, but it's nothing like what we're witnessing now. The pandemic has taken smart young people out of schools and universities, away from jobs that they needed, summer jobs that they needed, and has given them a cause that I think they have often believed in, but haven't had the space to do something with. And here they are, literally risking everything, joining these huge protest movements. And as I said, not only in the States, not only in Canada, but literally around the world. It is unbelievable what we're witnessing. And if we can't achieve something out of this, then we'll never achieve anything. So you've got to believe, and you've got to hope for leaders with the qualities and the determination to make things happen. And we are seeing some of that. I mean, there's a positive way of looking at some of what we've witnessed over the last week, even in some of the big corporations and the decisions they're making about change within their own system. So, are we in an awful situation, as witnessed by the videos we're seeing continuously? Absolutely. Are we at a moment of real impact where change could occur? I think we are in that moment. How we move forward is critical, because the opportunity is there to make real change. I mean, what was it, 3 years ago, the Murray Sinclair report came out, somewhere around there, 5 years now.
Wow.
5 years, with great hope that things were going to change, right? And that people would recognize that change was needed. And I think on the part of many non-Indigenous peoples, there was that belief that things had to change. But what's happened? What's changed?
Mhm.
What's really changed?
Well, I'll ask you both this journalism question, because before Murray Sinclair and Truth and Reconciliation was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Affairs by George Erasmus in 1996, and he was close to making change. Government fell, nothing happened. Journalists, Tanya, you're a journalist. Do we need to filter change? Do we need to become allies? Do we need to sort of drop the balance obsession, or what do you think has to happen there?
That's thank you for that question. So much needs to happen. When you look at the newsrooms across this country, you'll see a lot of white faces. You won't see a lot of black faces. You won't see a lot of red faces, hardly any at all. It's really quite remarkable. And that doesn't have to be, and there needs to be an effort made to hire Indigenous people, to hire Black Canadians. It says something when we join organizations and then we leave. And we've seen a lot of people join and then go, right? Why is that? It's because there needs to be a lot of change. There needs to be a lot of change. It really is quite difficult when you work for mainstream news organizations and they come out saying, no, it's not genocide. When we look at murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and when you hear those words from an employer that you have, it really strikes you in the heart as an Indigenous person, because it's a different lived experience. And we need to put Indigenous people, Black Canadians, in places of power. It's not just being a journalist. It's not being the editor. It's being the managing editor. It's being the publisher. It's having a seat on the board of directors of companies, of organizations. Who sits on the board of the CBC? We can look at so many people. Change needs to happen. Attitudes need to change. And it's not just at the bottom level. We need to go high and make things different. And that's when we'll see difference in coverage. That's when we'll see different ideas. And we'll see, I think, more of an open mind. I often get called an activist. People will say, oh, you're not a journalist, you're an activist. Because I was reporting on the truth, right? And I was reporting on what was happening in Thunder Bay about our children dying in the water. If you want to label me that, that's fine, because I feel like I said the truth. And the country did listen, and I hope they are listening now. But attitudes need to change.
Peter.
This will sound strange coming from a 71-year-old white guy trying to enter this part of this discussion, because at times I think there are too many 71-year-old white guys or 50-year-old white guys or whatever in some of these discussions, and not enough of people of color. But here's what I'd say. As somebody who worked at the CBC for 50 years, I haven't worked there for 3 years now. But it is embarrassing to see the contortions the corporation and some of its fellow broadcasters go through at a time when issues of race are raised, issues of racism are raised. It's embarrassing to see that most of the people who are making the decisions at the senior management levels, if not all of them, are white. It makes no sense. And it shows, a real slowness in the progression. Some things have happened very quickly and very admirably. There has been a lot of hiring of minorities, especially at the CBC, but they, over the last 15 years at least, but they're still trapped in the bottom level They're not up at the top level. And every time there's somebody, as far as I'm concerned, who's qualified for those senior levels, whether it's in the editorial leadership or in management, they don't get there. And the people who are sitting on the board of decision making are white people. Gee, what a surprise. They picked another white person. You know, it has frustrated me, as I'm sure it frustrates a lot of people. And I think Tanya was going that route as well in what she was saying.
Yeah, that has been a revelation that should have happened 50 years ago. But in any event, that's ringing loud and clear. And maybe, Tanya, to close, you can go anywhere you want because you're great on the education system. You've already addressed it a little bit. Healthcare or childcare and equal rights for Indigenous First Nations kids has been a big point in your time. Confusion over words, to see poor Commissioner Brenda Lucky try to struggle with systemic racism and not know, how to define it or how to explain it, or just like your cultural genocide point with the Prime Minister at one point. So anywhere you really want to take it, even if it's Minneapolis's tipping point, not just George Floyd, but 1968.
Mm-hmm. Miigwech for that. I think that we can do something in this country to make a change. We can do something in Ontario that's really quite easy and to make a change, and that is to make Indigenous education, Indigenous history, the true history of what has happened in this country, mandatory. 2 years ago, Premier Ford, when he came in, he made changes to our curriculum that was done by elders, was done by residential school survivors, was worked on by First Nations teachers and principals for years. This curriculum was put forward, and then sadly, the high school aspect of it, the history aspect of it, was all made a choice. It wasn't made mandatory, and it was supposed to be a mandatory change to how history is taught, what history is taught. And I always tell people that our history was not our choice. We could not opt out of what happened to our people in this country. So it's a least that we can do in this province now than to teach the true history of this country. And we can go in every province. We can do the same thing. Wouldn't that be wonderful? I know that education is a provincial responsibility, but make it happen. That's a change that's not going to, it's not painful, it's truth. That's one thing that I would like to see. I could go on about many things I would like to see because there are so many, but that is something simple. And in Ontario, it's right here.
Well, just before, Peter, I bring you in, 68 is where the Indian movement in the United States took hold in 1968, and they just toppled the Christopher Columbus statue. Tanya, what was, as you and I just talked, what really I loved about that gesture was that they went to the governor and the lieutenant governor ahead of doing it and had full support for a peaceful protest. So I would love a reflection on that before, Peter, I'll get the last word from you after Tanya here.
The American Indian movement started in Minneapolis, Minnesota. When I see what's happened with George Floyd, it took a long time for me to watch that video. And in large part, there are so many, like one of my thoughts as well was, we know what's been happening in that state for a very long time. And also too, Ojibwe people, my people, were very much behind the beginnings of AIM. And to see them topple the statue just a couple days ago of Christopher Columbus was really quite something. The genocide that's happened on this continent because of everything that came forward after contact is not something we want to see in a statue. Every time we drive down a main drag of a city, it's not something we want to see. We could talk about leaders here that have statues in Canada as well. Every time I see Sir John A. Macdonald, I just roll my eyes. Really? We have statues of him all over the place. For Indigenous people, we don't see Sir John A. Macdonald and want to celebrate. It's the exact opposite. What do we do about that? What do we do about that as a nation? That's something to think about.
And Peter, last word to you.
Listening to Tanya talk about the birth of the American Indian movement reminds me that in the early 70s, there was a huge protest at Wounded Knee in South Dakota that gained a lot of attention. I covered that story. I went back about a year later, or maybe 2 years later, and spent time with Russell Means, who was one of the AIM leaders at Wounded Knee. I was there looking into the death of a Canadian Indigenous woman, Anna Mae Akwash. But I spent time with Russell Means on the bigger picture as well. We walked some of the areas of the protest time that he'd been involved with. And I said, where does it go? Where does change ever happen? And he just looked at me and he said, change will happen. Change takes time. Change takes leadership, and change takes a willingness to stand up and be heard. A lot of those things are happening right now. Russell Means is dead. He died almost 10 years ago. But I would wonder if he sees this moment the same way we're hoping that this moment is, that real opportunity exists here to make a difference on all fronts on this issue. I hope so. I think we all hope so. But we can't be bystanders. We got to be part of it. We got to be part of change. That's it.
Just such a great privilege to hear you both here on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. So miigwech, Tanya, you're tremendous to do this for us. And Peter, the same. Continued success with the bridge. I'll be listening.
It's miigwech. Thank you.
As I said, what an opportunity. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Peter. We are back on Monday. It's Pride Month, and we will have a great focus on those issues when we have Brock McGillis and Dr. Cheryl McDonald. Join me 7 o'clock Eastern, 4 Pacific, Monday. As always, we'll close with our song lyric. Today, it's Leonard Sumner of the Little Saskatchewan First Nation in Manitoba. And he writes, "You catch my attention like a river's movement, smooth and swift, yet dangerous, so beautiful, so you gained my trust." That's from his new song, Dreamcatcher. For all of us, thanks for watching. So long.